Why do you feel emptiest after your greatest successes? You've achieved the promotion, earned the recognition, checked every box your father would have approved of, yet the satisfaction lasts maybe a day before that familiar hollowness returns. You tell yourself it's imposter syndrome or that you need bigger goals. But what if the real problem runs deeper than ambition? You spent your childhood chasing approval from someone who was never really there. He occupied space in your house, signed the checks, enforced the rules, but when you try to remember actual connection, the memory comes up empty. What you remember instead is performance, the careful calculation of what would earn his nod, the hollow satisfaction of being called good without ever being truly seen. Picture this. You're 8 years old, showing him a drawing you made. His eyes don't light up with curiosity about what you created or why you chose those colors. Instead, he scans it quickly, nods approvingly, and says, "Good job, keep it up." You got the approval you wanted, but something essential was missing. You couldn't name what. This wasn't neglect in the traditional sense. He was present, he provided, he even praised you when you met his standards. But somehow, beneath all that functional interaction, you remained fundamentally alone. The person you spent your life trying to please was never fully present to begin with. That won't make sense yet, but it will soon. You can recall the exact moment when you realized your father's attention had conditions. Maybe it was the Little League game where you struck out, and his disappointment filled the car ride home with silence. Maybe it was the report card with mostly A's and 1 B+, and his focus immediately went to the imperfection. Maybe it was simply the way he'd light up when you accomplished something, but remain neutral when you were just being yourself. You learned the difference between being praised and being known, though you couldn't articulate it then. Your father gave direction, not reflection. Encouragement, not intimacy. You learned to produce results, not to reveal yourself. Success became survival, and survival became identity. You discovered that masculinity meant obedience, not authorship. You were told you were doing well, but never asked how you were doing. The distinction matters more than you realized. One question measures output. The other acknowledges interior experience. One treats you as a project. The other recognizes you as a person. Your father wasn't cruel. Most weren't. He was operating from a blueprint he inherited, a script passed down through generations of men who learned to function without feeling, to provide without connecting, to supervise without nurturing. He gave what he had been given: structure, expectation, and the promise that compliance would be rewarded. What he couldn't give was what he had never received: the simple acknowledgement that your inner world mattered as much as your outer performance. He had no language for interiority because his own interior life had been systematically ignored. You learned to split yourself, one part that performed for approval, another part that held everything else: curiosity, spontaneity, genuine desire, authentic feeling. Over time, the performing part grew stronger while the authentic part grew silent. You developed what appeared to be self-discipline, but was actually emotional automation. You became remarkably self-sufficient, which adults praised as maturity. But what looked like strength was actually adaptation to emotional unavailability. You learned to read the room with extraordinary precision, sensing your father's mood before he himself knew he was in a mood. You adjusted your energy, your requests, your very presence to match what seemed to be wanted. This hypervigilance got praised as sensitivity or consideration, but it was really survival strategy. You learned that emotional needs were burdens rather than opportunities for connection. You stopped running to him with scraped knees or broken toys, handling these things yourself instead. Your early identity formed around these reward loops. You learned to anticipate what was expected rather than discover what was real. Affection became currency, scarce, conditional, and withdrawn without warning. Perform well and receive brief approval. Disobey and feel the chill of exile. Your father enforced this system not through conscious manipulation, but because it was all he knew. He mistook authority for intimacy, believing that structure and discipline were expressions of care. Your compliance became proof of his success, your achievements a reflection of his worth. Something essential got lost in this exchange. Your heart began to operate like a thermostat, constantly adjusting to maintain the temperature of approval. Your internal world became a series of preemptive adjustments, each one designed to avoid disappointment or conflict. You learned to be responsive rather than creative, compliant rather than curious. The father in your head became more powerful than the father in your life. Even after he's gone, that internal supervisor continues to monitor, measure, and manage. You never truly inherited your own life because you never stopped trying to earn approval from someone who was never fully present to begin with. This is why you struggle with decision-making that isn't task-related. Ask you to fix something, solve a problem, or complete a project, and you're immediately competent. But ask you what you actually want, not what you should want, not what would be smart to want, but what you genuinely desire, and you often go blank. The supervisor in your head has no protocol for that question. You can perform your roles with precision, employee, husband, father, but you struggle to access genuine feeling or authentic preference. You've been trained to be a highly functional machine, but internally, you remain vacant. You know how to manage teams because you understand systems and processes. You can solve problems because you've learned to break everything down into manageable components. But this competence comes at a cost you refuse to calculate. You struggle with anything that requires you to simply be rather than do. Intimacy becomes another performance. You learn the language of emotional connection, but apply it like a skill rather than expressing it as truth. You say the right things at the right times, but something essential is missing. Even your attempts at leisure become projects. You optimize your hobbies, gamify your relaxation, and turn your downtime into personal improvement opportunities. The vacation becomes a carefully planned itinerary. The weekend becomes a series of tasks to complete. The evening becomes time to be maximized rather than experienced. You regulate yourself before anyone else does. Everything becomes measurable: productivity, posture, tone, tempo. Your inner world becomes irrelevant unless it can be leveraged towards some external goal. You are the man without interior, not because you lack depth, but because you've been trained to treat depth as dysfunction. Emotion feels like failure. Vulnerability feels like regression. Rest feels like weakness. The only acceptable states are those that can be channeled into output. You excel professionally because you're reliable, disciplined, and results-oriented. You arrive early, stay late, and never miss deadlines. Your supervisors, the external ones, love you because you require minimal management, but you pay a price for this competence. The supervisor in your head whispers constantly, "Do more, be better, stay in control." But it never asks the questions that terrify you. What do you actually want? What brings you alive? What would you choose if no one was watching? These questions feel dangerous because they point toward the part of yourself that was never developed, never valued, never given permission to exist. Accessing it would require dismantling the entire system of self-regulation that has kept you functional for decades. You achieve your goals but feel nothing. You check every box but remain empty. You've mastered the art of functioning while losing the ability to feel. The internal supervisor promises that the next achievement will finally bring satisfaction. The next promotion, the next purchase, the next milestone. But satisfaction never comes because the supervisor isn't designed to provide satisfaction, only to maintain compliance. You become an expert at meeting expectations you never chose. You've climbed the ladder efficiently, but you're not sure why you started climbing in the first place. You've optimized your life for outcomes that don't actually matter to you. Success feels hollow because it was never really yours to begin with. You report feeling empty despite your achievements, but you can't understand why. The system worked exactly as advertised. You followed the rules, met the standards, earned the approval, but the promised fulfillment never materialized. Instead, you discovered that the system is without an end goal, only the perpetual need to keep performing. The supervisor's voice becomes so familiar that you mistake it for your own. You think you're being disciplined when you're actually being controlled. You think you're being responsible when you're actually being responsive. You think you're being mature when you're actually being managed. Philip Mainländer was a 19th century German philosopher who believed existence was a cosmic mistake. Not divine error, but accident, life as suffering, death as release. He didn't glorify pain or romanticize despair. He simply saw through the illusion of progress, recognizing that life's difficulties weren't temporary obstacles, but fundamental features of existence itself. You might dismiss this as philosophical melodrama, but Mainländer's insight cuts deeper than abstract theory. He identified what you experience but cannot articulate. Even in success, there is no nourishment. You achieve your goals, meet your standards, earn your approval, but your soul remains starved. The supervisor delivers results but cannot deliver fulfillment. Mainländer's central discovery was that the will to live, which Schopenhauer saw as existence's driving force, was actually the will to die. Life, he argued, was the universe's way of returning to non-existence. Every living thing participated in cosmic suicide, slowly working toward consciousness's dissolution. This resonates because you've been taught that every problem has a solution, every setback has a comeback, every failure has a lesson. The supervisor in your head promises that the right strategy, the right effort, the right mindset will eventually deliver the life you're supposed to want. But what happens when the system itself is the problem? When the very framework that promised meaning delivers only emptiness? You discover that the love you spent your life trying to earn through performance was never available in the first place. Your father wasn't withholding affection as punishment. He was operating from a system that had no room for affection at all. The supervisor couldn't provide what you actually needed because it was designed to manage behavior, not nurture being. Mainländer himself had a successful career as a teacher and philosopher. He published his masterwork, The Philosophy of Redemption, to critical acclaim. By external measures, he was accomplishing what he set out to do. But on the day his book was published, he hanged himself. He didn't want to die. He just couldn't keep pretending that achievements meant anything. You understand this more than you admit. The goals get achieved, the standards get met, the approval gets earned, but nothing changes inside. You succeed at everything except the thing that matters most, being alive to your own experience. The supervisor's demands become impossible to meet, not because they're too difficult, but because they're fundamentally hollow. This is the logical endpoint of transactional love. When performance becomes the only path to worth, and worth becomes the only path to survival, your soul eventually collapses under the weight of its own emptiness. You become an expert at functioning while remaining a stranger to feeling. You've doubled down on the supervisor model, endless cycles of self-optimization, clean diets, dopamine detoxes, gym routines, cold showers, meditation apps, productivity systems, none of which address the core starvation. You're not thriving. You're managing symptoms of a problem you refuse to name. You approach your body like a machine to be fine-tuned, and your mind like software to be debugged. You seek mastery over the physical because you have no map for the interior. You read about stoicism, but you apply it like emotional anesthesia rather than philosophical wisdom. You practice meditation, but you turn it into another metric to optimize. You pursue minimalism, but you make it about efficiency rather than presence. Every tool designed to cultivate being gets co-opted into the service of doing. You track your sleep, monitor your heart rate variability, calculate your macronutrient ratios, plan your workout splits, measure your productivity metrics. The self-improvement industry feeds on this dysfunction, promising that the right routine, the right mindset, the right habits will finally deliver the satisfaction that has remained elusive. But these approaches are built on the same foundation that created your problem, the belief that you can function your way to fulfillment. The supervisor in your head has simply been rebranded as personal development. The same internal mechanism that turned your childhood into performance is now turning your healing into performance. You apply enormous effort and discipline, but remain fundamentally unchanged. You biohack your way to perfect biomarkers, but still feel empty. You optimize your productivity, but still question why you're being productive. You build an impressive physique, but still feel disconnected from your body. The supervisor cannot heal what the supervisor created. You approach your own recovery with the same transactional mindset that created your emptiness in the first place. You become your own father, your own manager, your own critic. You never escape the system. You simply become more efficient at operating within it. The cult of self-discipline offers the illusion of progress while maintaining the underlying structure of self-supervision. You think you're being disciplined when you're actually being controlled. You think you're improving when you're actually performing. You think you're healing when you're actually managing symptoms. You burn out on self-improvement cycles because you're trying to solve a problem of being with solutions designed for doing. You're trying to heal a wound of connection with tools of isolation. The supervisor gets an upgrade, but it's still the supervisor. You struggle with genuine healing, not because of ignorance, but because of conditioning. Every step toward vulnerability feels like betrayal of your training. Opening up triggers shame. Rest feels like regression. Real recovery requires confronting the false father in your mind, the one who only cared when you performed. This means grieving a relationship that never existed. Not the loss of a father, but the illusion of one. You must acknowledge that the person you spent your life trying to please was never fully present to begin with. The approval you sought was never truly available. The love you earned was never love at all. You resist this recognition because it seems to dishonor your father. You were taught that respect means accepting his limitations without question. To acknowledge that he was emotionally unavailable feels like ingratitude. To admit that the relationship was transactional feels like betrayal. But this resistance keeps you trapped in the supervisor's system. You continue operating from the same framework that created your emptiness, hoping that if you just perform well enough, the love will finally appear. You remain a child waiting for approval from someone who was never capable of providing it. Healing requires you to turn toward the disappeared part of yourself, the part that was never valued, never developed, never given permission to exist. But this part feels foreign because it was abandoned so early. It holds all the things the supervisor labeled as unacceptable: spontaneity, curiosity, genuine feeling, authentic desire. Accessing this part requires dismantling the internal supervisor that has kept you functional for decades. You fear that without the supervisor, nothing will remain, that beneath all the performance and discipline and achievement, you'll discover emptiness. This fear keeps you trapped in cycles of optimization and self-improvement, afraid to discover what lies beneath the machinery of your own functioning. But the emptiness you fear is not the absence of self. It's the absence of the false self that was constructed to earn approval. Your real self, the disappeared part, is still there. It has been waiting, not for permission to perform, but for permission to exist. When the supervisor dies, something else can emerge. But this isn't a gentle transition. It's a collapse, a dissolution, a period of profound disorientation. You discover that you're no longer an object to be measured, but a subject to be met. There is no one left to impress, only someone to discover. This discovery cannot be managed or optimized. It requires crossing the desert of disillusionment, walking through the wreckage of everything that once provided structure and meaning. You must learn to exist without the constant feedback loop of external validation. You must develop tolerance for not knowing, for not having a plan, for not being in control. The supervisor's death reveals the extent of its control. Without its constant monitoring, you don't know what you want, what you feel, or what you value. You've been so focused on meeting external standards that you have no internal compass. You discover that you've been living someone else's life with extraordinary precision. You begin to understand that you never had a father. You had a supervisor. The difference is profound. A father loves unconditionally. A supervisor manages performance. A father sees the child. A supervisor sees the behavior. A father nurtures development. A supervisor enforces compliance. This recognition is both liberating and terrifying. Without the supervisor, you must learn to navigate life without constant external reference points. You must develop your own sense of worth, your own internal compass, your own relationship with desire and meaning. You must learn to exist without justification. The question that emerges from this collapse is simple but devastating. Who are you without the applause? It cannot be answered through analysis or effort. It can only be lived moment by moment, choice by choice, breath by breath. The answer emerges not from thinking, but from the simple act of existing without the need to earn the right to exist. You'll notice something strange when you finally stop performing. People become uncomfortable around you. They sense it even if they can't name it. The weight of your presence unsettles them because you no longer fit into the predictable categories they use to feel safe. You've stepped off the stage, stopped reading from their script. Without that script, they don't know what to do with you. You've stopped being a character and started being a man. Most will turn away, but a rare few, will recognize what you've become. Someone who exists not because he earned the right, but because he simply is.